The sheriff's cruiser idled in the snow-choked driveway, red and blue lights cutting across the farmhouse walls like a blade. Inside the car, a deputy leaned toward the radio and said, low and dismissive, "She's just an old widow, probably confused. We'll clear this fast." Margaret Collins stood behind her front door and heard every word through the thin glass. Her hand rested on the deadbolt. It did not shake. Her breathing was slow, measured, the way it had been taught to her decades ago, back when panic could cost lives. Outside, the wind screamed across the open plains of northern Wyoming, hurling snow sideways, flattening the world into white noise. The night had already taken power from half the county. Now it was taking patience. The knock came hard, not polite, not uncertain. Authority wrapped in knuckles. "Ma'am, open the door." Margaret did not move. She looked instead at the kitchen table behind her. One chair, a stack of unopened envelopes, property tax notices, final warnings. The red ink bled through the paper like a quiet threat. The house smelled of old wood, coffee gone cold, and the faint medicinal bite of oxygen tubing coiled beside the wall. Her late husband's boots sat by the door, cracked leather still dusted with last winter's salt. Another knock, louder. "We know you're in there." Across the yard, beyond the cruiser's lights, 20 motorcycles sat half buried in snow, their chrome dulled, their engines ticking as they cooled. The men who rode them stood in a loose cluster near the barn, shoulders hunched, faces wrapped in scarves, breath pouring out in thick white clouds. They did not speak. They watched the house. They watched the door. Some of them watched the cruiser with open distrust. Others kept their eyes down, conserving energy, conserving temper. Margaret turned the deadbolt and opened the door just enough for the cold to slash inside. The deputy nearest her glanced down, already forming his judgment. 74 years old, thin, gray hair pulled back without care, a cardigan too light for weather like this. He saw fragility. He saw inconvenience. "Ma'am," he said, slower now, the way people spoke to those they assumed were losing time. "We got reports you've got a group of men trespassing on your property." Margaret met his eyes. Hers were clear, sharp, unblinking. "They knocked," she said. Her voice was calm. "I answered." The deputy frowned. "You're aware who they are?" "I'm aware of who they aren't," Margaret said. "They're not warm, they're not safe, and they're not criminals just because they ride loud machines." Behind the deputy, the sheriff stepped forward. Older, heavier. His breath wheezed faintly in the cold. He took in the scene more carefully. The bikes. The barn door cracked open to let heat spill out. The extension cords running from the house to the heaters Margaret had dragged out herself. His eyes lingered on her hands. They were steady. Too steady. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "you alone out here?" "Yes." "You got family nearby?" "No." "That makes this dangerous." Margaret's mouth tightened. "What makes it dangerous," she said, "is leaving people to freeze because they make you uncomfortable." The sheriff looked past her into the house. He saw the oxygen tank, the pill organizer on the counter, the medical textbooks stacked beneath old magazines. That gave him pause. Not enough to understand, just enough to hesitate. A gust of wind tore across the yard. One of the men by the barn staggered, caught himself on a fence post. Another reached out without a word and held him upright. Their movements were practiced, quiet, disciplined, not drunk, not reckless, something else. The deputy scoffed. "You can't just shelter anyone who shows up, ma'am. This isn't a motel." Margaret leaned closer to the door. The cold brushed her cheek, but she did not flinch. "This isn't charity," she said. "It's survival." From the group, a man stepped forward, tall, broad. His beard was streaked with ice, his eyes red from wind and exhaustion. He stopped well short of the porch, palms open, posture controlled. When he spoke, his voice was rough but deliberate. "We didn't plan to stop here," he said. "Storm shut the highway. One of ours went down hard. We needed shelter, just for the night." The deputy snapped back, "Nobody asked you." Margaret did not look away from the man. She noticed the way he stood slightly angled, shielding the others from the wind. She noticed how the rest of them deferred without being told. Leadership without noise. The sheriff studied him. "You the one in charge?" The man hesitated. A flicker. Then, "Tonight, I am." Margaret felt it then. Not fear, recognition. The kind that settled in her bones. She had seen this posture before. In hospital corridors at 3 in the morning. In men who had learned how to stay standing when everything else collapsed. The sheriff exhaled. "We'll need names." "You'll get them," the man said, "when the road opens." The deputy laughed once. Sharp. "That's not how this works." Margaret stepped fully onto the porch. Snow soaked through her slippers. She did not notice. "That's exactly how this works," she said. "Because until the county plows reach this road, I'm the only one between them and hypothermia." The sheriff turned to her. "Mrs. Collins, you understand the liability here? If something happens, I understand responsibility," Margaret cut in. Her voice hardened. "I carried it for most of my life." Silence stretched. The wind howled. Somewhere in the distance, a transformer blew, and the horizon flickered dark. One of the bikers coughed. Deep. Wet. He bent forward, hands braced on his knees, breath hitching. Margaret's eyes snapped to him instantly. She was off the porch before anyone could stop her. "Sit!" she ordered. The word carried weight. The man obeyed without question, dropping onto a crate by the barn wall. Margaret knelt beside him, fingers already at his wrist, counting silently. "Too fast. Too shallow." She looked up. "Who has oxygen?" A younger man froze, then pointed toward a saddlebag. "We do. But bring it." The deputy stared. "Ma'am, this isn't your problem." Margaret did not look at him. "It is now." As the tank was hauled out, the sheriff watched the scene unfold. The precision, the way the men moved when she spoke, the way her hands never hesitated. Not a confused widow. Not tonight. Margaret fitted the mask, adjusted the flow, watched color creep back into the man's face. She stayed there until his breathing slowed. Only then did she rise, joints stiff but resolve unbroken. She turned back to the officers. "You can write your report," she said. "Or you can get back in that car and keep your engine running so the battery doesn't die. Either way, they're staying." The sheriff met her gaze. Something shifted. He nodded once, slow. "We'll check back at first light," he said. The deputy opened his mouth to protest. The sheriff silenced him with a look. The cruiser's lights clicked off. The engine idled. Margaret stood in the snow, the barn behind her filled with heat and quiet voices, the house behind her heavy with memory. She was cold, she was tired, and the night was far from over. Because miles away, beyond the darkened highway, engines were already turning. The radio crackled in the sheriff's cruiser, a thin sound swallowed by wind. "County to Unit 12. Plows stalled at mile marker 76. Visibility near 0. The sheriff answered with a clipped acknowledgement, then shut the radio off. He sat there longer than procedure required, staring at the dark farmhouse, as if trying to read a verdict written in its windows. Inside the barn, heat pooled low and uneven. Space heaters hummed. Shadows jumped across rough timber walls. The men had spread out without being told, backs against posts, helmets lined carefully on a workbench, as if order itself were a form of respect. No one touched anything that did not belong to them. No one raised their voice. Margaret moved among them with quiet authority, a mug in each hand. Coffee, weak but hot. She passed them out one by one. Some took it with a nod, some with both hands like an offering. When she reached the man she had treated, he tried to stand. "Don't," she said. He obeyed instantly. His eyes lifted to her face, searching, not challenging. "Thank you," he said. The words came rough, scraped from somewhere deep. "Name's Michael." She studied him for a beat too long. Not recognition, not yet. Something closer to disturbance. "Drink slowly," she said. "Your lungs are angry." He gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "They've been that way for years." From the far end of the barn, another man spoke. Older, Gray threaded through his beard. "Ma'am," he said, "careful. We don't want to bring trouble down on you." Margaret turned. "You didn't," she said. "Trouble doesn't need an invitation. It finds people just fine on its own." A few of the men exchanged looks. Not surprise. Calculation. This was not a woman who spoke from fear. Outside, the sheriff's door opened and closed. Boots crunched in snow. He approached alone this time, hands visible, posture eased. He stopped short of the barn entrance. "You ever think about selling this place?" he asked, conversational, like he was asking about the weather. Margaret did not answer immediately. She set the empty mugs down. "Every winter," she said finally. "Every spring I decide not to." "It's a lot for one person," the sheriff said. "It's a lot for anyone," she replied. "That doesn't make it negotiable." The sheriff nodded, slow. "We'll have deputies rotating past till morning, just to be sure things stay calm." "They will," Margaret said, "because I said so." He looked at her then, really looked. The line of her shoulders, the steadiness in her stance, the way the men watched her without realizing they were doing it. He tipped his hat just slightly and walked back toward his cruiser. When the sound of the engine faded into the storm, the barn settled into a deeper quiet. Wind battered the outer walls, snow rattled like gravel. The world beyond the barn might as well have ceased to exist. One of the men laughed softly, not with humor but disbelief. "Hell of a woman," he muttered. Margaret heard him. She did not respond. She moved to the far corner where the old tack room opened into a smaller space. A cot leaned against the wall. She dragged it out, ignoring the protest in her knees. Before she could unfold it, hands reached in from both sides. The cot was open in seconds, blankets layered neatly. "You don't need to do that," she said. A younger man shook his head. "We do." She paused, then allowed it. Authority sometimes meant knowing when to step back. As the night deepened, the storm pressed harder. Time blurred. Men dozed, sitting up. Someone fed wood into the small stove. Margaret checked Michael's breathing every half hour without fail. Each time she marked something new. The way his chest tightened before a cough, the faint tremor in his left hand. Details that did not belong to a simple storm exposure. "You been to a doctor recently?" she asked him quietly. He hesitated. "Not since the VA clinic closed out our way. That was 3 years ago." "Yes, ma'am." Her jaw set. "You're lying to protect someone," she said. "I just don't know who yet." Michael looked away. The silence confirmed it. Near dawn, the storm finally began to break. The wind softened, though the cold sharpened in its place. Pale light crept over the snowfields, turning them blue, then gray. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the first movement on the road. Not plows, not yet. Headlights. Far too many of them. Low, steady, disciplined. She felt it before she understood it. A pressure in the chest. Not fear, anticipation. Behind her, floorboards creaked. The tall man from the night before joined her, keeping a respectful distance. He followed her gaze to the distant line of lights. "They came faster than I expected," he said. "How many?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. "Enough." The barn door opened. One by one, the men stepped out into the morning cold, forming a loose line without being instructed. No panic, no confusion. Jackets were straightened, gloves pulled tight, faces set. Margaret turned to Michael. "You should be lying down." He stood anyway. "I won't," he said. "Not for this." The sound grew. Not chaotic, controlled. Engines throttled low, synchronized. A vibration that traveled through wood, through bone. Margaret stepped onto the porch again, wrapping her cardigan tighter. She saw the first bikes crest the rise, then another wave behind them, then another. Black shapes against white ground, stretching farther than the eye could easily count. The sheriff's cruiser reappeared, then another, then 3 more, lights off, engines running. Deputies stood near their doors, hands resting close to belts, faces tight. The lead bikes slowed as they reached the property line, A signal passed through the formation. Engines dropped to idle in unison. The sound fell away, leaving a silence so abrupt it felt physical. Margaret stood very still. A man dismounted at the front, older than most, broad-shouldered, movements economical. He removed his helmet and held it at his side. His eyes found Margaret immediately. He walked forward alone, each step deliberate. He stopped at the edge of the porch, looking up at her. "You're Margaret Collins," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. My name doesn't matter," he said. "What you did last night does." Behind him, hundreds of men sat astride their bikes, waiting, not watching the house, watching him. Margaret's voice was steady. "I did what anyone should." A faint smile crossed his face. "No," he said. "You did what most people don't." He turned slightly, gesturing back toward the barn where Michael stood, supported on either side. "That man would not have made it through the night without you." Margaret looked at Michael again. This time, memory stirred. Not clear, not complete. A hospital room, a younger face, blood on a sleeve, a hand gripping hers too tightly. The man continued, "Years ago, when he was still learning how to survive what he brought home from war, you treated him, for free, after hours, when nobody else would." Margaret's breath caught. "Just once." "I remember," she said quietly. The man nodded. He never forgot. Behind him, engines cut completely. Helmets came off, hundreds of them. Heads lowered, not in spectacle, but in recognition. Margaret felt the weight of it then. Not the noise, the absence of it, the attention, the gravity. And she understood, finally, that this morning was not an ending. It was an arrival. The silence held longer than comfort allowed. Not a single engine turned. Not a voice rose. The men on the bikes stayed still, boots planted, hands loose on handlebars, eyes forward. It was not submission. It was restraint. Margaret felt the cold creep through the porch boards and into her legs, but she did not step back. She had learned long ago that retreat, once begun, rarely stopped where you intended. The man at the front spoke again, his voice carrying without effort. "My people don't come to towns like this," he said, "not unless there's a reason." The sheriff shifted behind her. He cleared his throat, the sound small in the open air. "We appreciate you keeping things orderly," he said, aiming for authority and landing closer to plea. "But this many vehicles, this kind of gathering, we're going to need to understand what's happening." The man glanced at him, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply assessing. "You already do," he said. "You just don't like the scale of it." Margaret lifted a hand slightly. The motion was small. It stopped the conversation cold. "This is still my property," she said. "And whatever this is, it doesn't happen without my consent." A ripple passed through the men, subtle, approval maybe, or respect. The man at the front inclined his head toward her, just enough to acknowledge the shift in power. "Then I'll be brief," he said. He turned, raised one gloved hand, and pointed toward the barn. At the signal, a group of men dismounted and moved forward on foot. Not all of them, just a few. They carried no tools, no boxes, just themselves. They stopped several yards short, forming a half-circle that left Margaret unobstructed. Michael stepped forward with them. His face had color now, but his eyes were tired. He stood straighter than he should have been able to. "I didn't tell them everything," he said to Margaret, his voice low. "Not at first." She studied him. "You rarely do," she said. It was not accusation, it was observation. He swallowed. "I didn't want them thinking I needed saving again." The man at the front turned slightly, enough to include Michael in his line of sight. "You didn't," he said. "You needed help. There's a difference." Michael nodded once. Relief flickered across his face, then vanished beneath discipline. The sheriff took a step forward. "Sir," he said, "we've got regulations about assemblies this size. If this turns into—" "It won't," the man said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We didn't come to make a statement. We came to settle something unfinished." Margaret felt it then, the shift in the air. Not threat, intent. "What kind of unfinished?" she asked. The man looked at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something human broke through the steel in his expression. "The kind that sits with you for years," he said. Quiet, heavy, waiting. Behind him, the line of men remained unmoving, but Margaret sensed the tension running through them like a live wire. This was not spectacle. This was personal. She stepped off the porch. The sheriff inhaled sharply. "Mrs. Collins, I'm fine," she said without looking back. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked forward. The men parted instinctively, creating a path without being told. Michael watched her approach, his jaw tight. She stopped in front of him. "You should still be resting," she said. "I will," he said. "After." She waited. Silence had taught her patience better than any lecture. Michael exhaled slowly. "When you treated me years ago," he said, "you wrote something on my discharge note." Her brow furrowed. "I wrote a lot of things." "You wrote," he continued, "this body survived worse than it remembers." Margaret closed her eyes. Just for a second. "You kept that?" she asked. He nodded. "Carried it in my wallet until it fell apart." The man at the front watched the exchange, unreadable. Michael's voice steadied. "I told them what happened last night, how you didn't hesitate, how you didn't ask questions, how you didn't treat us like a problem to be managed." Margaret opened her eyes. "I treated you like people," she said. "Yes," Michael said, "and that's why they're here." The sheriff looked between them, confusion deepening into unease. "You're saying this is gratitude?" The man at the front answered him. "No," he said. "This is accountability." That word landed hard. Margaret felt a prickle at the base of her neck. "Accountability for what?" she asked. "For letting people like you stand alone," he said. "For driving past places like this and telling ourselves someone else would take care of it." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the farmhouse. "You shouldn't be fighting foreclosure at your age. You shouldn't be rationing heat. You shouldn't be deciding which bills matter more than safety." The sheriff stiffened. "Now hold on!" Margaret raised her hand again. The sheriff stopped mid-breath. "You've done your job," she said. "Let me do mine." She faced the man. "You didn't know any of that when you came," she said. "So don't rewrite the story." The man considered her. Then he nodded. "You're right," he said. "We didn't. We learned it." A murmur moved through the crowd. Not agreement, acknowledgement. One of the deputies spoke quietly into his radio. "County," he said, "we're going to need guidance." Static answered him. The man at the front turned back to the formation and raised his hand again. This time the signal was different. Controlled. Specific. From the back of the line, a small number of bikes peeled away and rolled forward, engines barely above idle. They stopped near the edge of the property. Saddlebags opened, clipboards emerged, thick folders. Not cash, not weapons. Margaret narrowed her eyes. "What are those?" "Paperwork," the man said. "The kind that takes time. Lawyers, accountants, permits." She did not relax. "And what do you think that buys you?" "Nothing," he said. "It earns us the right to ask." The sheriff stepped forward again, voice strained. "Ask what?" The man looked at Margaret. "Permission," he said, "to fix what shouldn't have been broken." Margaret crossed her arms. The cold no longer bothered her. "You don't get to decide that." "No," he agreed. "You do." She looked back at the house, the peeling paint, the sagging fence, the memory of nights spent calculating which rooms to heat and which to sacrifice. She looked at the men, hundreds of them, waiting without demand. She turned to the sheriff. "If I say no," she asked, "what happens?" The sheriff hesitated. Then he said carefully, "They leave. And I file a report that says nothing illegal occurred." She turned back to the man. "And if I say yes?" "Then we work," he said, quietly, legally, on your terms." A long pause. Margaret breathed in. The air smelled like snow and oil and something else. Resolve. "Then here are my terms," she said. Every man leaned in just slightly. "No publicity, No press. No handouts that make this look like charity. Anything done here is done by the book, or not at all. The man smiled. Not wide, not proud. Agreed. And, she added, eyes locking onto Michael, you follow my medical instructions. Michael nodded immediately. Yes, ma'am. Margaret looked at the line of bikes stretching into the distance. Then you'd better get started, she said, because winter doesn't wait for anyone. The man raised his hand one final time. This signal carried weight. Engines did not roar. They did not surge. They simply came alive, steady and controlled, as groups began to move with purpose. Margaret stood in the center of it all, not elevated, not diminished, just present. And for the first time in years, the house behind her did not feel like a burden. It felt like a responsibility shared. The work began without ceremony. No one shouted instructions. No engines revved for effect. Men moved in small groups, each one already knowing where he belonged. A ladder appeared against the side of the house, placed carefully so it wouldn't scrape the old siding. Another group headed toward the barn roof, boots testing each step before committing weight. A generator was rolled out and positioned downwind, far enough that its noise wouldn't overwhelm the house. Margaret watched from the porch, arms folded, eyes sharp. She saw everything, who stepped where, who waited to be told, who didn't. She had spent too many years reading hospital rooms to miss the unspoken hierarchy forming in her yard. The sheriff stood off to the side, phone pressed to his ear, voice low. No, he said, they're not breaking anything. Yes, I'm sure, I'll call you back. He ended the call and exhaled through his nose. County's nervous, he said to no one in particular. They can be, Margaret replied. Nerves don't break laws. A man approached her slowly, clipboard tucked under his arm. Late 50s, clean-shaven, glasses fogged by the cold. He stopped a respectful distance away. Ma'am, he said, I'm Daniel Brooks, retired CPA. We'll need copies of your tax notices and the foreclosure letters. Nothing leaves this property without your say. Margaret studied him. The glasses, the careful diction. You don't look like you belong out here, she said. He smiled faintly. Neither do most of us, he replied. Appearances simplify things. Truth complicates them. She nodded once. Kitchen table, she said. Second drawer. As he turned to go, the sound of coughing reached her ears. Not Michael. Someone else. Shorter. Younger. A man leaning against the barn wall, face pale beneath wind-burned skin. Margaret was moving before anyone called her name. Sit, she said again. The word landed. The man slid down to a crate, embarrassed. I'm fine, he muttered. You're lying, Margaret said. She crouched, checked his pulse, listened to his breathing. You rode too long without stopping. I didn't want to slow them down. That's how people end up on ventilators, she said flatly. Drink this. She pressed a thermos into his hands. He obeyed. Across the yard, several men noticed. They said nothing, but their posture changed. Attention sharpened. This was not concern out of politeness. This was trust being reassigned. Michael approached, carefully. You're not supposed to be doing all this, he said. Margaret looked up at him. I'm not supposed to be doing a lot of things, she said. I do them anyway. He hesitated. You don't owe us, she cut him off. This has nothing to do with owing, she said, and everything to do with competence. Sit down before you undo my work. He sat. The house creaked as men moved inside, careful not to track snow across the floors. Tools appeared. Measuring tapes snapped open. Someone checked the fuse box and shook his head. Another wrote something down and nodded. Every movement was restrained, deliberate. No one touched the framed photographs on the mantel. No one opened drawers without asking. Margaret followed Daniel into the kitchen. Papers spread across the table like a quiet confession. He adjusted his glasses, scanning dates, figures, margins. You've been paying what you can, he said. Yes. That's kept the lien from escalating, he said. Barely. Margaret leaned against the counter. How long? With proper legal intervention, he said carefully, this can be resolved. Not erased. Resolved. She met his gaze. I don't want favors. He nodded. Then you'll like this. It won't be a favor. It'll be a correction. Outside, a shout cut through the cold. Not alarm. Alert. A man waved from the roof, pointing toward a beam sagging near the eaves. Another answered, then disappeared down the ladder. Within minutes, materials were being unloaded from a truck Margaret hadn't even noticed arrive. The sheriff watched it all, unsettled. He approached Margaret again, lowering his voice. You understand how this looks. I understand exactly how it looks, she said. That's why it's being done this way. And if the press shows up, they won't. How can you be sure? She glanced toward the man at the front of the formation, still standing where he had been since morning, watching everything without intervening. Because this isn't about being seen. As if summoned by the thought, the man approached. He stopped beside her, eyes scanning the work. They're efficient, he said. They're respectful, Margaret replied. That matters more. He nodded. It does. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind shifted. Snow slid off the roof in a heavy rush. Margaret did not flinch. You could have said no, he said. Yes. You didn't. No. Why? She took her time answering. Because I've spent enough years watching systems fail decent people, she said. And when one of those systems finally pauses long enough to listen, you don't waste the moment. The man studied her, then looked out across the property. You know, he said quietly, most people would have asked for more. Margaret's mouth tightened. Most people aren't paying attention. A deputy jogged up, breathless. Sheriff, he said, state highways reopened, traffic starting to move. The sheriff nodded. All right, he said. He turned to Margaret. I'll need to document what's happening here. You can document that no one is blocking the road, she said, and that no laws are being broken. He hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he smiled. You should have been a lawyer, she snorted. I prefer fixing things before they need arguing. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, weak but persistent. The worst of the cold eased. Roof panels were secured. A section of fence was reinforced. Firewood was stacked neatly along the house, cut to length. Inside, the kitchen filled with the quiet rhythm of people working around one another without collision. Margaret stood at the sink, washing mugs. Her hands ached. Her back protested. She ignored both. Through the window, she saw Michael sitting on a bench, oxygen mask off now, talking to the younger man she'd treated earlier. They were laughing, softly, carefully. Daniel returned, folders tucked under his arm. We've contacted a legal aid office in Cheyenne, he said. They're expecting your call. They'll handle the rest. Margaret dried her hands slowly. Good. That's all? That's enough. He smiled, genuine this time. You're not what people think. She looked at him. Neither are you. Outside, engines began to turn over again. Not all of them, just a few. Controlled departures. The man at the front raised his hand, signaling a gradual withdrawal. The formation loosened, not rushed, not chaotic. Margaret stepped back onto the porch. The cold bit. She welcomed it. The man joined her, standing just close enough to be heard over the wind. This won't be the last time people show up because of you, he said. She looked out over the snow-covered fields. I'm not looking to be a landmark. He smiled faintly. Too late. She met his gaze. Then make sure they come for the right reasons. He inclined his head. We will. As the first wave of bikes rolled out, Margaret felt the house behind her settle. Not lighter, stronger, anchored. The storm had passed. What followed would test her far more than the cold ever had. By late afternoon, the yard no longer looked like a spectacle. It looked like a job site winding down. Only a fraction of the bikes remained, parked along the tree line, engines cold now, their riders sitting or standing in small clusters, talking in low voices. The rest had peeled away in stages, disappearing down the reopened highway, leaving behind silence that felt earned rather than abandoned. Marg stood alone in the living room, the house quieter than it had been all day. Tools were gone, Boots were gone. The air still carried a faint trace of oil and cold metal, layered over the familiar scent of old wood and soap. The oxygen tank rested where it always had, against the wall, its presence no longer a reminder of loss, but of endurance. She sat slowly in the chair by the window. Her knees protested sharply this time. She let them. Pain, like winter, was honest. It told you exactly where you stood. Outside, the sheriff lingered near his cruiser, finishing notes he didn't want to rush. He glanced toward the house, then away, unsettled by how little of the morning's tension remained. No arrests, no citations, nothing dramatic to justify the knot still sitting in his chest. Inside the barn, Michael stood with the man who had led the formation. They spoke quietly, out of sight, voices steady. "You should have told me sooner," the leader said. Michael exhaled. "I didn't want it turning into this." "It didn't," the man replied. "It turned into something else." Michael leaned back against a beam, eyes closing briefly. She didn't have to do any of it, last night or today. "No," the man said. "She chose to." That word lingered. Margaret watched through the window as Michael stepped out into the yard. He paused, squared his shoulders, then walked toward the porch alone. His steps were slower now. Careful. Not weak. Intentional. She opened the door before he knocked. "You're not supposed to be walking that much," she said. He smiled faintly. "I know." They stood there, the space between them filled with things neither rushed to say. "I didn't recognize you right away," she said finally. He nodded. "I didn't expect you to." "You were thinner," she said. "Angrier." He laughed softly. "I still am, just better at hiding it." She studied his face, the lines, the scars that weren't physical. "You survived," she said. "So did you." They shared a look that didn't need elaboration. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the attention, for the disruption." Margaret shook her head. "You didn't bring disruption, you brought consequence." He frowned slightly. "That sounds worse." "It's not," she said. "It just lasts longer." Michael glanced back toward the barn where a few men waited at a distance, deliberately giving them privacy. "They want to say goodbye," he said, "properly." She sighed. "Then they should." The men approached in pairs. No crowding, no ceremony. Each one met her eyes, offered a nod, a quiet word. "Thank you." "Respect." Some added nothing at all. That was enough. When the last of them turned away, the leader remained. He stood at the edge of the porch, hands relaxed at his sides. "You've done more than you realize," he said. Margaret crossed her arms. "People keep saying that, and you keep not believing them." She considered it. "I believe actions," she said, "not interpretations." He smiled. "Then watch." He raised his hand once more. Not a command, a signal of closure. The remaining bikes started up, low, controlled. One by one they rolled past the house, not fast, not slow. Each rider lifted a hand as they passed. Not a salute, not a display, an acknowledgement. Margaret stood on the porch and watched until the last one disappeared beyond the rise. The sheriff approached once the sound faded completely. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You need anything?" She looked at him. Really looked. "Not from you," she said, "but thank you for asking." He nodded, accepting the boundary. "You ever need help with the county, you call me." "I will," she said. She knew she probably wouldn't. When the cruiser finally pulled away, the land settled into itself. Snow creaked softly as it began to refreeze. A hawk circled overhead, indifferent to the morning's drama. Margaret closed the door and leaned her forehead against it for a moment. The house felt different. Not transformed, clarified. She moved through the rooms slowly, taking inventory. The repaired beam, the sealed window, the stack of firewood outside the kitchen door. Changes that did not shout. On the kitchen table lay a single folder Daniel had left behind. Contact numbers, instructions, no promises, just pathways. She sat and opened it, read every page. Not with hope, with discernment. As dusk crept in, she lit the lamp by the window, the same lamp she had used for years. Its glow felt warmer now, though nothing about it had changed. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee, fresh this time. She carried it to the chair and sat, watching the road. Somewhere far beyond the hills, engines would be settling for the night. Somewhere closer, the world would continue pretending it hadn't noticed what happened here. She noticed, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. Night came back gently, without ceremony. The temperature dropped fast once the sun slipped behind the hills, but the house held its warmth. Margaret noticed it when she reached for her cardigan and realized she didn't need it yet. The repairs had done their quiet work. No drafts crawling along the floor, no whistle through the window seams. The house breathed differently now. She stood at the sink, rinsing her mug, when headlights swept briefly across the front wall. Not flashing, not urgent. A single vehicle slowing, then stopping. Margaret didn't tense. She dried her hands, moved to the window, and looked out. Michael stood near the gate, alone. No bike this time, just boots in the snow, hands tucked into his jacket pockets like he wasn't sure what to do with them. She opened the door before he knocked. "You're supposed to be resting," she said again. He gave a small, tired smile. "I am. This is me resting." She stepped aside and let him in. The door closed softly behind them. The silence inside was different now, not empty, expectant. He glanced around, taking in the room without touching anything. "Looks stronger," he said. "It is," she replied. "So am I." He nodded as if he understood that was not a joke. They stood there for a moment, neither rushing the conversation. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, calmer now, more like a breath than a warning. "I wanted to give you this myself," he said finally. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. Thick, not sealed. He held it out but did not let go immediately. Margaret did not take it. "What is it?" "An affidavit," he said, "signed, witnessed, about the night you treated me years ago, and about last night." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" "Because sometimes systems only listen when people leave a paper trail," he said, "and because I don't want anyone rewriting what happened here." She considered him. "You think that's coming?" "I know it is." She took the envelope, weighed it in her hand. "You don't owe me proof." "I owe you accuracy," he said. "There's a difference." She nodded once. "Sit." He did. Margaret poured him a glass of water, watched the way his hands shook just enough to notice, exhaustion finally catching up. "You going back out with them?" she asked. "Not for a while," he said. "Doctor's orders." "Yours." "That's smart. Doesn't happen often." She allowed herself a faint smile, then let it fade. "You knew what would happen if you called them," she said. "Yes." "And you did it anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" Michael leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. "Because I've spent half my life pretending I didn't need anyone, and last night proved I was wrong." Margaret said nothing. She let the truth sit where it belonged. "You know," he continued, "they listen to me, but they listen to you differently." She scoffed softly. "They don't know me." "They know what you did," he said. "That's enough." The clock on the wall ticked steadily. The sound no longer irritated her. "People like them," she said slowly, "people like you move through places. You don't stay." He met her eyes. "Would you want us to?" She shook her head. "No, but I want you to remember where you stopped." He nodded. "We will." Another pause, deeper this time. "What happens next?" he asked. Margaret looked toward the window where darkness pressed gently against the glass. "Next," she said, "I make some phone calls. I follow instructions I've been ignoring out of pride. I stop pretending I can outrun time. And after that," she turned back to him, "after that, I live." The word landed with weight. Michael stood carefully. "Then I should go." She walked him to the door. He hesitated, hand on the knob. "You don't have to keep saving people," he said. "I know," she replied. "I just choose to." He nodded, then stepped out into the night. Margaret closed the door and rested her hand against it, feeling the solidness beneath her palm. Not fragile, not temporary. She returned to the chair by the window and sat. Outside, the road lay empty, snow glowing faintly under the moon. For the first time in years, the quiet did not feel like an ending. It felt like space. Morning arrived without drama. No sirens, no engines, just pale lights sliding across the snowfields and settling gently against the farmhouse windows. Margaret woke in her chair by the window, stiff but rested in a way she hadn't felt in years. The clock read 6:42 in the morning. She noted it without hurry. She rose slowly, joints complaining, and stood there until the dizziness passed. It did. It always did. The house was quiet but not hollow. The repairs held. The air was still. She made coffee, stronger this time. The smell filled the kitchen, grounding, familiar. As the kettle heated, she noticed something she hadn't the night before. The silence no longer pressed in on her ears. It existed. It did not accuse. Outside, tire tracks crisscrossed the yard, but already the edges were softening under fresh snow. Evidence fading, as it always did. She carried her mug to the table and opened the folder Daniel had left behind. She read it again, slower this time. Legal aid contacts, county numbers, a handwritten note at the bottom. Call me if anyone gives you trouble. They won't, but still. Margaret folded the paper neatly and slid it back into the folder. She did not rush to the phone. She had learned that urgency was often borrowed panic. A knock came at the door. Not loud, not demanding. 3 steady taps. Margaret did not startle. She crossed the room and opened the door without hesitation. A woman stood on the porch, late 60s, heavy coat, hair pulled back too tight. Her eyes were sharp with curiosity and something close to discomfort. "Morning," the woman said. "I'm Elaine Foster. I live down the road." Margaret nodded. "I know." Elaine shifted her weight. "People are talking." "They usually do." Elaine glanced past her into the house. The warmth, the solidity. "They said you had company." Margaret met her gaze. "I did." Elaine hesitated. "They said it was a lot of them." It was. Another pause. Elaine's voice lowered. "You scared some folks." Margaret considered her carefully. "Fear is rarely about the thing in front of you," she said. "It's about what you don't want to admit you've been ignoring." Elaine frowned. "That's not fair." "No," Margaret agreed. "It's accurate." Elaine's shoulders dropped slightly. "I brought soup," she said, holding up a container. "I didn't know what else to do." Margaret stepped aside. "Then you did fine." Elaine entered, awkward, eyes scanning the room. "Everything looks different." Margaret took the soup. "Some things were fixed." Elaine nodded slowly. "I heard the county might help you now." Margaret set the container on the counter. "They might." "And you didn't ask them?" Margaret looked at her. "Not until they were ready to listen." Elaine exhaled. "I didn't know you were struggling." Margaret's voice was calm. "You didn't ask." That landed. Elaine looked down. "I should have." "Yes," Margaret said. "You should have." Silence stretched. Then Elaine straightened. "If you need help clearing snow this winter, I'll let you know." Elaine nodded, accepting the boundary, then turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm glad you didn't freeze." Margaret met her eyes. "So am I." After the door closed, Margaret stood alone again. But the solitude had changed shape. She sat back down with her coffee and stared out at the road. A county truck passed in the distance, slower than usual. Observing, measuring. Her phone rang. She let it ring twice before answering. Margaret Collins. "Mrs. Collins," a man said. Polite, official. "This is the county assessor's office. We've been made aware of some concerns regarding your property." Margaret smiled faintly. "I imagine you have." There was a pause. Papers rustled. "We'd like to schedule a review. No penalties, just a conversation." "That's new," she said. "Yes," the man admitted. It is. She looked out at the fields again. I'm available Thursday morning. Another pause. We'll be there. She hung up and leaned back in her chair. Nothing had been solved yet, not really, but something had shifted. Power rarely announced itself. It adjusted quietly, then waited to see who noticed. Margaret noticed. She finished her coffee, stood, and pulled on her coat. Outside, the cold met her like an old acquaintance. She welcomed it. The world was moving again, and this time, it was moving around her. By mid-morning, the road was no longer empty. A pickup slowed as it passed the house, then another. Not curiosity alone, something more deliberate. People looking without wanting to be seen looking. The kind of attention that followed a quiet disruption, not a spectacle. Margaret stood at the window and watched them go. She felt no satisfaction in it. Attention was a tool, useful only if you knew how to put it down before it cut you. She buttoned her coat and stepped outside. The cold met her fully now, clean and sharp. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked the perimeter of the house, checking the repairs herself. The new beam held. The patched siding lay flush. The fence line was straighter than it had been in years. Not perfect, honest. At the edge of the property, she stopped. The land fell away toward the highway, quiet again. Too quiet. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Unknown number. She answered without greeting. Mrs. Collins, a woman's voice said. Professional, controlled. This is Karen Whitlow with the State Zoning Office. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. There it was. Yes, she said. We've received inquiries, the woman continued, about activity on your property yesterday. The scale of it raised some flags. I imagine it did. There are regulations regarding organized gatherings, Whitlow said, even temporary ones. Margaret looked out over the snowfields. Then you should be relieved, she said, because nothing about yesterday was disorganized. A pause. That's not how the concern was framed, Whitlow said. Then the framing is inaccurate. Another pause, longer this time. We'd like to send someone out, Whitlow said, to assess. You're welcome to, Margaret replied. Thursday morning. I already have an appointment. The line went quiet. You're well prepared, Whitlow said finally. Margaret opened her eyes. I've had practice. After she hung up, she stood there a moment longer, feeling the weight of the day settling into her bones. This was the part no one applauded, the aftermath, the quiet pressure of systems adjusting themselves around an anomaly they hadn't anticipated. Inside, she made lunch, simple, soup reheated, bread toasted. She ate standing at the counter, eyes distant. A knock came again, firmer this time. She opened the door to find the sheriff standing there, hat in hand, expression careful. You got some calls already, he said. Yes, so did I. She waited. County commissioners want a briefing, he said. State's asking questions. Nothing hostile, just curious. Curiosity cuts both ways, Margaret said. He smiled thinly. You've made a few people uncomfortable. I've lived with discomfort most of my life, she replied. It hasn't killed me yet. He nodded. They're not sure what to make of you. Margaret looked at him steadily. They don't need to. A gust of wind swept across the yard, lifting snow into brief spirals before letting it fall again. The sheriff followed her gaze. You sure you don't want representation? He asked. Lawyer, advocate. She shook her head. Not yet. That's a risky choice. So is assuming someone else will speak for you. He tipped his head, conceding the point. I'll keep things slow on my end. That's all I ask. After he left, Margaret closed the door and leaned against it just for a moment. Her breath came out steady. She was not afraid, but she was alert. The afternoon passed with small interruptions. A delivery truck brought lumber receipts that needed signatures. Daniel called to confirm the legal aid appointment. Elaine returned with a shovel and an awkward offer to help clear the drive. Margaret accepted without ceremony. They worked in companionable silence for a while. Then Elaine spoke. You know they're going to talk about this for a long time. Yes. You don't seem bothered. Margaret paused, leaning on the shovel. When you've been invisible long enough, she said, being talked about feels less dangerous than being ignored. Elaine nodded slowly. I never thought of it that way. Most people don't, Margaret said, until it's too late. As the sun dipped lower, casting long blue shadows across the yard, Margaret felt the fatigue settle in earnest. Not weakness, accumulation. She went inside, poured herself another cup of coffee, and sat by the window again. The road lay quiet, but she no longer mistook that for peace. Power had brushed past her life, briefly, decisively. Now the question was not whether it would return, it was how she would meet it when it did. The evening news reached her without sound. Margaret saw it first as light flickering across the darkened window, reflections from a television left on somewhere down the road. A truck passed slowly, then stopped. The driver did not get out. The engine idled. Watching. She did not turn on her own television. She didn't need it. She could feel the shift already, the way the air tightened when something private brushed too close to public appetite. Her phone rang again. This time the number was familiar. Daniel, she said. They picked it up, he replied. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded resigned. Local station, no names yet, just footage. From where? Highway cam, drones maybe. Someone leaked it upstream. Margaret closed her eyes. How bad? That depends on your tolerance for speculation, he said. They're asking who you are, why that many riders stopped here, what kind of arrangement was made. And your answer? I told them the truth, Daniel said, which made them less interested. She smiled faintly. Of course it did. They'll keep digging, he warned, especially once they realize there's nothing sensational to uncover. People hate an ending without villains, Margaret said. It makes them nervous. She hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound keeping her company. Outside, night settled again, thicker than before. Not hostile, watchful. A knock came at the door, harder than before, not aggressive, urgent. Margaret stood, joints stiff, heart steady. She opened the door. Two men stood on the porch, suits, no coats heavy enough for Wyoming cold. Their breath fogged the air as they adjusted themselves, unused to waiting. Mrs. Collins, the taller one said, we're with the state. Yes, she replied. I assumed. He glanced past her into the house, cataloging. The other one didn't bother. His eyes stayed on her face. We'd like to ask you some questions, the first man said, off the record. There's no such thing, Margaret replied, but you can ask. They exchanged a look. The second man spoke. Are you affiliated with any organizations connected to yesterday's gathering? No. Did you authorize it? I allowed people to stay warm, she said, if that's what you mean. Did you receive compensation? No. Then why, the first man pressed, did they mobilize at that scale for you? Margaret looked at him closely. You're asking the wrong question. Then help us with the right one. She stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her. The cold cut sharply. She welcomed it. It kept her thoughts clean. You want to know why they came, she said. You should be asking why no one else did. The men stiffened. For years, she continued, this county sent letters instead of people, notices instead of conversations, threats dressed up as procedure. Yesterday, strangers showed more restraint than the systems meant to protect me. That's a serious accusation, the second man said. It's an accurate one, Margaret replied, and accuracy matters more than comfort. The taller man cleared his throat. We're trying to prevent escalation. Escalation happens when pressure has nowhere to go, she said. I released it. A pause. The second man studied her, something like reluctant respect flickering in his eyes. You're not what we expected. Margaret smiled thinly. That's been true my entire life. They thanked her without warmth and left, boots crunching into the snow. Margaret stayed on the porch long after they disappeared, the night settling around her like a held breath. Inside, she poured herself a small glass of water and sat. Her hands trembled now, just slightly. Adrenaline draining. She allowed it. Control didn't mean denial. She thought of the riders, of Michael, of the man who had stood at the front and waited for her consent instead of assuming it. Power, she realized, did not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it arrived quietly and asked permission. Her phone buzzed once more. A text this time. Unknown number. You did the right thing. Whatever comes next, you won't face it alone. She did not reply. She turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening to the house hold its shape. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, erasing tracks, blurring evidence. But not memory. Not this time. The first sound that morning was not an engine or a knock, but paper sliding through the mail slot. Margaret woke in her bed this time, not the chair, the ceiling above her unfamiliar in the way familiar things become after change. The house held steady around her, warm, quiet. She lay still until her breath evened, then rose and crossed the room with care, feeling the solidness beneath her feet. The envelope waited on the floor like it had weight. No logo, no stamp she recognized, just her name written clearly without flourish. She picked it up, turned it once in her hands, then set it on the table and made coffee first. Some things were not opened on an empty stomach. Outside, the road was clear. Snowbanks pushed back. The county had come through early. She noted that, filed it away where small changes lived. She opened the envelope only after sitting down. Inside were copies, not originals, bank correspondence, tax records, a notice of suspension on the foreclosure review pending reassessment. Language careful enough to protect itself, but clear enough to read between the lines. Margaret leaned back in her chair. She did not smile. Relief was not the same as victory. Relief simply meant you could breathe long enough to decide what came next. Her phone rang. She answered without checking the number. Mrs. Collins, a woman said, voice practiced but no longer distant. This is Karen Whitlow. We spoke yesterday. Yes, Margaret said. I wanted to inform you, Whitlow continued, that after review the state has decided to pause all enforcement actions related to your property, effective immediately. I'm aware, Margaret said, tapping the envelope lightly. A pause. You move quickly. I've learned to, Margaret replied. Whitlow cleared her throat. There will be conditions, oversight, scheduled reviews. Of course. And, Whitlow added, hesitating, there may be media interest. We recommend discretion. Margaret looked toward the window where sunlight cut across the repaired fence. Discretion is my default, she said. Noise belongs to people who need it. The call ended politely. Too politely. By late morning, the first reporter arrived anyway. A sedan parked just past the gate. A woman stepped out, notebook in hand, smile already assembled. Margaret watched from the porch and did not invite her up. Mrs. Collins, the reporter called. I'm just hoping for a comment. Margaret descended the steps slowly. Then you should keep hoping. The woman blinked. Excuse me? I didn't ask for attention, Margaret said. And I'm not renting my life to the curious. This is a big story, the reporter insisted. People want to understand what happened. Margaret held her gaze. People want entertainment, she said. Understanding takes work. The reporter hesitated, recalibrated. You don't want your side told? My side, Margaret said, is lived, not summarized. The woman stood there another moment, then nodded stiffly and retreated to her car. It idled for a few seconds too long before pulling away. Margaret went back inside and closed the door. The latch sounded firm, reassuring. She spent the afternoon on the phone, legal aid, county offices, a call to a veterans clinic on Michael's behalf, made without ceremony or expectation of thanks. Systems responded differently now, slower in tone, more careful with their words. Power, she realized, had a way of changing voices before it changed outcomes. Near dusk, Michael returned. Not alone this time. He brought groceries. Nothing extravagant, practical things, fresh bread, soup that hadn't come from a can. I didn't ask, he said, setting them on the counter. I didn't forbid it, she replied. He looked better, still tired, still carrying too much behind his eyes, but standing. "They're moving on tonight," he said. "The rest of them, I assumed. They won't be back like that," he added. "Not here." Margaret nodded. "That's fine." He hesitated. "But I will." She met his eyes. "That's your choice." "Yes," he said. "It is." They ate quietly at the table, not ceremonially, just two people sharing food without performance. Outside, the sky deepened into blue, then black. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "You changed something," he said. She shook her head. "I revealed it." He smiled, then left without another word. That night, Margaret slept deeply, the kind of sleep that came after effort, not exhaustion. Morning brought a letter from the county, formal this time, apologetic without apology. A meeting scheduled, options outlined, language softened. She read it once and set it aside. The house felt alive now. Not loud, not busy, alive in the way things were when they were used, not endured. She took a walk down the road, further than she had in years. Neighbors waved, some awkward, some sincere. She acknowledged them all without stopping. At the crest of the hill, she paused and looked back at the farmhouse. It stood firm against the land, no longer shrinking into itself. Margaret breathed in the cold air and felt no urge to rush back inside. The world had not become kinder overnight. Systems had not grown souls, but lines had shifted. Attention had been redirected. Silence had been broken and resealed on better terms. She turned and walked home at her own pace. That evening, she sat by the window again, coffee in hand, watching the road without waiting for it to deliver anything. The quiet did not threaten her now. It accompanied her. Somewhere, engines would continue to move. Cameras would search for spectacle. Officials would draft memos to justify adjustments they would never name as fear. Margaret let them. She had done what she needed to do. Not to be seen, not to be saved, but to stand where she was and refuse to be moved without consent. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment 3 words.